Today, we're exploring the science of breath, ancient practices meeting modern neuroscience. My guest is Amy Kartar, a neuroscientist and breathwork researcher who's uncovering how high ventilation breathwork, paired with music, can introduce profound altered states of consciousness, the kind only associated with psychedelics. We'll talk about how this practice changes the brain, why it could help people processing emotional pain, and how century-old spiritual traditions are finally being validated by modern science. Get ready to discover the mind's incredible potential, one breath at a time. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Amy, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. A couple months ago, I would say now, I did an article on your recent paper, which is titled Neurobiological Substrates of Altered States of Consciousness Induced by High Ventilation Breathwork Accompanied by Music. And so for some people, they're like, what is all of that? It's really looking at breathwork and how it affects us in our neurological state and while using music, but using breathwork to do that. And historically, we've seen ancient civilizations do this and ancient communities, and the spirituality community obviously speaks about this as well. And tons of different organizations like the Monroe Institute and different not-for-profits and DOPS, the University of Virginia, have looked into these things. And so you found yourself writing a paper about this, and I found it deeply interesting. And so before we get into more on the paper and how breathwork really affects us from a neurological state in a mind and body state, I'd like to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Your article was great. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you so much. It was great. Honestly, I had so much fun writing it. Who sent it to me was Christopher Plain. He found your paper and he sent it to me and he was like, Chrissy, this is right up your alley. And I said, oh my gosh, it is. And I literally came from the Monroe Institute and I was like, this is perfect. And so when I was writing it, I really enjoyed it. Sometimes you enjoy writing articles and then sometimes there's ones that you don't enjoy as much. This one I really did. So how did you find yourself, researching breathwork in combination with just neurology?
I mean, it was serendipity, really. I'm really interested in people and I wanted a people-focused project to look at. And my supervisor had also been approached by another student who wanted to research psychedelics. And we don't actually have a license for psychedelics at the University of Sussex, at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, where I work. So they looked at the next best thing. And that's when I came in, I happened upon this project and it ticked all my boxes. And I was honestly really lucky, to be honest, to work in such a great institution where, people are the focus. And the rest is history. Here I am several years down the line.
Fair enough. And have you found it challenging, though, to do this type of work? Maybe not just so much in the space that you're working in the university you're working at, but just in general. Have you found that there's been any pushback when looking at breath work and how it can affect us from a neurological state and how it affects our mind and body?
Mm-hmm. I think because Brighton is quite open-minded, I haven't had to face any resistance as such. People tend to be really interested. But funding acquisition is really hard because there's obviously the opposite of what pharma do. You're not looking at any kind of medications and they have a lot of money in their pockets to be able to fund projects. So that's the thing that I found tough. But one of my colleagues has, recently got a really good fellowship for breathwork. So I think things are changing. The tide is turning. So hopefully for our future projects, it should be a little bit easier.
Yeah, I hope so, because it's so important. I think, we would want to be able to get away from medication and be able to do things naturally, right? That should always be the first and foremost important thing. Can we do this from a medicinal perspective outside of bringing in different types of drugs and how that can affect our body in the long term?
Yeah, for sure. I think for lots of health problems, the answer can lie within us rather than diving straight into medication. So yeah, I agree.
I agree. And I love that you're doing this work. So I please do more because we need more of this. And we need more of it peer reviewed because we don't always have a lot of that. And the more there's more, universities doing it, and there's more people and more scientists looking into it. But you're right. From what I see, it's sometimes hard to push it through to the end.
Mhm.
Can you break down a little bit about what high ventilation breath work is? And it's the acronym is HVB, compared to psychedelic substances, and how it induce altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, of course. So there are loads of different names for these types of fast-paced breathing techniques, which I think kind of impedes its investigation. If you're not looking at one umbrella term, it can be quite hard to advance the research because people might argue you focused on this type of breathing and not this. So kind of in effort to align with the breathwork community, but also to make it scientific, we named these types of fast-paced breathworks high ventilation breathwork because that's what you're doing. You're either increasing the rate or the depth of the breath. And it's really hard to narrow down which types of breathwork come into this because there are so many, probably even as a breathwork researcher, so many types that I haven't even come across yet. So that's why we named it HVB for sure. Also, if you call it hyperventilation, there are quite negative connotations associated with that. People think of panic, mental health illness, and it's seen as a negative concept in science, I would say. So we also wanted to steer clear of that. In terms of its effects, I mean, this research is in its infancy right now. We wrote a massive review article. It's really lengthy, about the possible mechanisms that underlie the altered state of consciousness that is known to result from doing this breath work. And what we think is that it's eliminating carbon dioxide. That's really important. So then the pH of your blood becomes more alkaline, which causes vasoconstriction. So your blood vessels tighten throughout your body as you eliminate carbon dioxide when you breathe faster. And this causes a whole bunch of altered mechanisms. So less blood flow to the brain. It changes the efficiency of oxygen delivery in cells. We also think that it causes a state of hyper sort of excitability of the brain, which might shift metabolism to glycolysis. So there's all these effects, downstream effects from essentially eliminating carbon dioxide. And we think that it's this physiological change that basically results in this altered state of consciousness that breathwork practitioners widely report.
So what is in the carbon monoxide though, that obviously we are expelling it and we don't want to keep it in our bodies for
Yeah.
longer periods of time, but why carbon dioxide?
It's a tough question. I think just because it alters your physiology so much that is the important thing. After doing breathwork for such a long time, you also probably become hypoxic. So it's a lack of oxygen as well. So there's a paper by Havanith and colleagues that finds that the more carbon dioxide people release, the more altered their state of consciousness tends to be. So, research is starting to identify that the catalyzing factor of this altered state of consciousness is probably reducing carbon dioxide and inducing respiratory alkalosis, so changing the pH of your blood.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so the more that we do this, that changes our pH. That I've never heard. That's amazing. It changes our pH of our blood.
Mm-hmm.
That I find that so fantastic because I guess it is our stabilizer, right? But you would think it would maybe be the water within our bodies, that we're holding on to because what are we? I think we're 70% water of
Yeah.
carrying around. So it's interesting that, and again, I am nowhere near a scientist or even in the health related field, but it's interesting that it's our blood and the pH levels that contribute to lowering that and the carbon dioxide, or would it be hiring the pH levels?
Yes, yeah, it makes the pH more alkaline. Yeah. But if you think about, with the fact that even our blood vessels constrict, you've got a reduced amount of blood flow reaching the brain, which is probably going to change activity in your brain somewhat. If your whole system is changing and its physiology very quickly, the thing that I like to imagine is that the breath is the only automatic reflex that we can voluntarily control. So our body is like, what's going on? Why are you doing this? But we still continue to do it. So, of course, these dramatic shifts in physiology occur because there's nothing else like this.
So, is there anything else that we know outside of doing this type of or any type of breath work that, alkalines your pH levels that's going towards your brain, which is really interesting, and the quality of blood that is going to your brain in specific areas of your brain? Is there any other type of practice outside of psychedelics? Because I would imagine that psychedelics does something similar to the pH of your blood. Maybe it doesn't. Is there anything else that is non-psychedelic or medication based that does that besides breath work?
I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I would imagine that some kind of drug could replicate this, but I don't know of it. Um, and I know that psychedelics don't act upon the same mechanism, so they bind to a specific receptor and catalyze different kinds of reactions. So it's not directly comparable to psychedelic drugs either. They're two different things. But off the top of my head, short answer, no, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm like, I just wonder what's in the pH balance of
Yeah.
blood that helps to contribute to this. Like that, I think I've never heard that before. I think that's so fascinating. It's like one of those things you add to your list, when you're here, right? Exactly.
Yeah,
When I'm
sure.
talking to neurologists or researchers, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting. I've never heard that before, especially when it deals with blood. But it makes sense when it comes to circulation because we need within our brain, we need blood flow. We see that certain parts of the brain don't operate well when they don't have blood flow to that area, and we can see that in SPECT scans. Yeah, so it's fascinating. So there are specific areas in the brain that I would say light up or become a little bit more involved when this is happening with breath work. Can you break down what areas of the brain that when this doing this type of high ventilation breath work it's affecting,
Yeah, of
or
course.
not affecting, or maybe shutting down as well, or calming down is a better way of saying?
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. So we knew to expect that globally across the brain, blood flow would reduce thanks to these really early hyperventilation studies. And this is essentially hyperventilation. So we expected whole brain blood flow to reduce. And we weren't necessarily just interested in that. We wanted to look at where the altered state of consciousness experience correlated with blood flow changes, because we thought that might give us an idea of like, okay, this region is especially important because the effects that they're reporting correlate with changes in this area. So we looked at changes in global blood brain flow changes with the subjective experience that they reported. And we found that in the early stage of breath work, blood flow reduced and correlated with the strength, the intensity of these feelings of joy, bliss, euphoria in the left parietal operculum and posterior insula. These areas are involved with bodily awareness. So reductions in blood flow here might indicate that people's, bodily awareness is changing, is kind of breaking down, which might explain some of the effects that we hear of disembodiment, of feeling outside of their own bodies, of connecting with the environment more. So quite early on, we found this change, this reduction in blood flow might indicate that this area is potentially less active. Later on, we found a very interesting finding that we didn't expect to see. We found that in the late phase of breathwork, that there was actually some kind of blood flow increase. And this also correlated with the intensity of experience. So this means that the bigger the increase in blood flow to this area, the more strongly they rated feeling sort of out of their bodies and having an altered experience, essentially. And this was really interesting because this was in the right amygdala and hippocampus, so a little cluster touching this region. And these areas are famously known to be involved in fear and memory processing. So we thought it might indicate increased activation, so that people could be processing emotionally salient memories. Because we know from breathwork studies that while the physiology changes almost immediately, the effects tend to emerge later on. And these increases in blood flow in this area in the later stage might indicate, that people are processing emotional memories, essentially.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
We don't know a lot about the brain, and we're learning more consistently about it and its function and how it affects us, and in addition to what is consciousness, and do we tap into consciousness, or are we creating consciousness, right? I have interviewed people from DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Science from the University of Virginia. And they talk about when people are going through forms of out of body experiences, or they're going through these kind of psychedelic states, there's the sides of the brain. And again, not a neurologist, but there are parts, the sides of the brain that shut down when people are going through these form of psychedelic experiences, right? In these altered states of mind. And they find that there is this connection between consciousness, or, the experiencer, seeing things where we think it's consciousness, or experiencing things in those states. And it's exactly that we see with psychedelics. We also see people that have Alzheimer's disease actually going through the same thing. Those areas in the brain have actually shut down as well, just like they would be on a form of some psychedelic state. Doesn't mean that they're in this blissful experience, but they're their brain is doing similar activity. Did you find that that's would be the similar regions while doing breath work, that those areas might be calming down as well?
The only ones we looked at, we used arterial spin labeling, which is blood flow changes throughout the brain. So we actually probably used a different type of imaging. Most people for those studies would use fMRI. And we only looked at, because the whole blood flow to the brain changed, like I said earlier, so we only looked at areas that significantly correlated with the intensity of oceanic joy, blissful, psychedelic-like feelings. So we only looked at this specifically because our study was an exploratory study. Nobody had done this before, so we didn't have any set regions we wanted to look at. So with the areas that I mentioned earlier were the only ones that we recorded in our study. Hopefully, future studies, now that there's some kind of brain findings out there that we've put out there, future studies will be able to look at regions in more depth. But like I say, we only looked at where changes correlated with the intensity of feelings.
It's amazing. It's just so interesting to see how breath work can just either change our mood, our state so quickly, right?
I find it amazing.
I do. It's unbelievable. The ancients have been doing this for years, centuries.
Yeah.
People could debate how long they've been doing it, but for
Yes.
quite a while, and it's always been within ancient practices, and in some indigenous communities and other communities that we see, it's still very prevalent. Did you look at any past ancient civilizations, or even just modern day indigenous groups or other groups that are still practicing breath work and how it affects them? And did you interview them, and what was your findings when you looked at both historical and maybe modern day evidence?
Great question. My colleague, he is a breathwork facilitator, and he's really interested in the different types of modalities and practices. So when we wrote our big sort of scoping review on how breathwork might work, where it's used, he actually took that section. So I haven't personally, I don't believe he interviewed anyone either, but I would really love to do that, to dive deeper into, where certain practices come from. But it's often quite daunting because it's happened since forever. Where do you begin? Who do you speak to? But I'd love to visit India, where pranayama comes from, the vital force of life. So I haven't done enough work into that area yet, but I would like that to come.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting. We see even historically the Beatles, they were doing, they were doing a lot of different breath work, and knowing that the Beatles were doing holotropic breath work, and it was George Harrison that was doing it, and he brought that into the Beatles, and that's when we got like some really psychedelic albums that came out later on, is because of George Harrison going to India and learning about meditation and different types of breath work, and he brought it back, and I believe the rest of the Beatles started practicing it along with a lot of other substances on top of it. But that's where we got this unbelievable, next road of music and albums that came from was part of that. And breath work, I would say, contribute to a lot of that artistic creativity.
Yes, I was going to give you a fun fact about holotropic breathwork is that it was actually invented when psychedelics were banned. They wanted to find a way to recreate these effects. It was by Dr. Stanislav Grof, who was really interested in how altered states basically facilitated mental well-being. So that was why it was invented. How interesting.
That is interesting. And it's amazing that it contributes to so many things that we don't realize that have been embedded in our culture, right? Like the Beatles is one of them. For your next work in this field, what is the next things that you're looking to do? And when it comes to breath work, and how does it contribute to the work that you're doing now?
Oh, there's so much I'd like to do. It's hard to know where to begin. I mean, we need to replicate the study we've done on a larger scale. I really want to look at breathwork naive participants, so people that have never done it before, because our study was on expert practitioners, so people that had done breathwork before, because we didn't want any adverse effects. We didn't want people to be, not feeling good. We wanted safety in the lab. But I think having seen and heard from so many people that practice breathwork, how amazing it is and how beneficial, that it's really important to look at what happens the first time people do it. So that's also something. There's also there's not enough, in my opinion, research on looking at breathwork for mental health. There's loads of anecdotal reports about people getting over PTSD, depression, anxiety by doing this kind of fast-paced, high ventilation breathwork, but there's not enough studies on it. So I'd really love to do that. But we also need lots more imaging studies because, our paper is the first to look at what happens in the brain in this way during breath work, but there's so much we don't know. So there's loads of different angles. I think it will just be spontaneous. I think, oh, sorry, don't say that. I shouldn't say that. I'm not sure basically what's going to come first, but any of those things I'd like to explore.
That's amazing. Well, and there's so much to research and discover, right? I think that's the beauty of this area is that you can never stop learning and you can never stop looking even at the historical aspects to the modern day aspects and then what future will entail, right? And how we use breath work within our modern day abilities, right? And it's something that we can practice now, but maybe it will be somewhat, hopefully one day, used on a global level.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, here in the UK, we have the NHS, and it would be amazing. There's things like mindfulness. I know there's another clinical trial that I work on, which is looking at interoception and heartbeat focused things to reduce anxiety. But I would love to see eventually there's been enough, clinical trials implemented that breath work can one day be one of these therapies that we offer to people. Yeah, we tried to do that in this study. So that's why we tried to find the mechanisms that probably produce this altered state of consciousness that people report. So we administered a questionnaire called the 5 Dimensions of Altered States of Consciousness, which is a questionnaire that is widely administered in psychedelic clinical trials and so on. And we wanted to be able to compare our findings to their findings. So we looked at this feeling I discussed earlier, this oceanic boundlessness, which in our study was the most highly rated domain in that scale, which is similar to the findings in psychedelic research. So we inferred that people entered altered states of consciousness by high scores in this domain in the questionnaire. And then we tried to understand where the changes in the brain correlate with the strength of this experience. So we've tried to find the neurobiological mechanisms that cause this altered state of consciousness by looking at this data. But I think it doesn't quite capture the richness and the intensity of this experience. People have all of these beautiful feelings and bodily sensations that aren't quite captured by this questionnaire. It's more directed towards, psychedelics research. So I think questionnaires need to be developed for breathwork specifically because you can't really compare the two. They do differ in some domains. So psychedelics induce sort of visual alterations, I would say more strongly than breathwork does, but breathwork probably has stronger bodily sensations. So more work needs to be done to understand this change, this crazy drastic change in consciousness, and we are looking at that, but more needs to be done to resolve it. But I wonder almost if it's ever going to be fully explored and understood, because it's such a complicated thing that results from, physiology and phenomenology. I think it's going to take a while.
Yeah, I think so too. There's just so much attached to consciousness because we would wonder what kind of state, if we had to look at consciousness in a form of like areas or degrees, right?
Mhm.
Or levels of consciousness, where that would sit. How deep are you involved within your consciousness within you, right? And how do you measure that is almost the Murrow Institute has tried to find ways to do that, but there's it would be so hard because everybody's level of experience within that depth of consciousness would be different.
So different. You're right. It's an uphill battle, this one.
Amy, thank you so much for being rebelliously curious with me today. And please stay in contact. The work that you're doing is wonderful. I would love to write about it, learn more about it. I know my listeners and people reading these articles and that are interested in states of different consciousness would be or will be very interested in this podcast. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.